Welcome to the Boosted Volunteer Podcast. We share the stories of dedicated Booster Club volunteers and the tools and strategies they use to run successful booster clubs. We also have sought-out experts on fundraising, volunteer management, and running nonprofits to share best practices. Hosted by Robin Eissler and Evan Eissler, you won't want to miss these great episodes that will help you run your booster club like a champ.
Hey, Evan, excited to talk with you today on the podcast.
Hey, Robin, it's good to be here. It's been a while, but I'm excited to be here and to get a chance to interview the host today. It should be fun.
It's always fun to kind of flip roles and I get to answer the questions instead of ask them.
Yep. Well, yeah, for those of you that don't know, Robin is the CEO and founder of Booster Hub. She's been in the Booster Club world for a number of years now, a couple of years serving as a president, and then now almost 5 years, right? Serving as the CEO of Booster Hub and working with hundreds of booster clubs across the country every day.
Yep, it's been just over 5 years since we started Booster Hub, so we get to look inside, peek under the hood, if you will, of really now thousands of booster clubs across the country and see what's actually happening and hear the hot topics. Yeah, and before that, I volunteered a lot. I've been volunteering in booster clubs for about 10 years, so got a lot of good insights and excited to share some of them today.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to see what we can get into. You've been working with booster clubs every day. You see all the things every day. There's a lot of shifts going on, a lot of new things happening. What are some of the biggest things that make like now and today to dive into this podcast and get all these answers?
Yeah, I think as the government across the nation, nationwide, all the states keep reducing funding for extracurricular activities or what they consider essential education, there's just more and more of a shift to the booster club model, and more of the funding is now coming from the booster clubs. And of course, as you shift more of the responsibility and more of the funding to these external nonprofits, then things like compliance pop up and strategy and all these things. Whereas before, hey, we were just showing up to volunteer at the concession stand. I'm going to sell M&Ms and we're going to make a couple $100 and you guys are going to get new t-shirts out of it. But now we're talking about like long-term strategic planning for how do we make sure our marching band exists 5 years from now? And how do we make sure our football program exists and our girls volleyball, water polo, and choir and FFA and all those different types of activities? They're now kind of, in a lot of places, they get their own individual booster club. So it's not just like one big umbrella program, but it's focused down on the actual activity. So that's really the big shift that we're seeing overall.
And can you kind of talk to some of the listeners who might not be completely familiar with what a booster club is or why it's so important? Like what makes them crucial to extracurricular activities?
Yeah, some people don't know the difference between a PTO or PTA, parent-teacher organization, and a booster club. And so the PTA is pretty connected to the school, and most of its direction is given by the school, and it falls under like usually a major national nonprofit. Booster clubs are independent nonprofits, so they're like this separate entity that's formed specifically to support a specific activity. And again, in some schools, that may be all the athletics. It may be every single extracurricular program, or it may narrow it down to one sport or activity. So you may have a debate booster club, and you may have a 4-H or an FFA booster club, and then all the sports in between. And so those nonprofits are built to raise money and then rally volunteers and support the students doing that activity.
And as we're moving towards the 2026-2027 school year, obviously, people are starting to get ready. All the boosters are starting to get ready for the school year. How are you seeing all the people? Are they stressed out? Are they excited? Are there certain things they're thinking about or certain things they might not be thinking about that they should be?
I think there's just a hint of uncertainty. Obviously, anything that happens on the world stage impacts people at the local level. So there's just a little bit of uncertainty. Are we going to be able to raise enough money this year? Are our students going to be able to do the things that we've mapped it out for them to do? And then I think you've got really two camps. You've got booster clubs that are doing well. They've got their volunteer roles filled. They're raising enough money. And then you've got those that just can't get enough people to help. And they're always having to communicate with people and trying to get people to volunteer, and they can't raise enough money. And I think what those two differences boil down to is strategy. So I think the programs that are doing well, They have come in with a big plan and an intent, and they've got delegated roles and people in charge of very specific things. And those people are responsible and accountable for those. And on the other side, I think it just all gets dumped on one or two people, and they may not even have the manpower yet or like the ability to pause and step back and look down into the organization and say, hey, wait a minute, rather than the day-to-day being in the weeds, what can we do to make this organization healthy for long term, not just to get through this season, but what's our long-term plan?
And some of those clubs that you see doing really well with their long-term plan, and you might see that they're set up for success in the future. What are some things that they're implementing?
Yeah, some big things. So first of all, budgeting. So they have a budget that looks at this year and then maybe next year, and then they have some long-range planning. They usually have really good role descriptions. So this is what the president does, this is what the vice president does, this is what the treasurer does, even down to their committees. We have a nominating committee that helps us find people for the booster club. Well, if you have a committee that's their whole job, it's probably going to be a little easier for you to find volunteers than if you're one person just, I just need some help, somebody help me. So it's kind of, it's like we see in business, the companies that step back and make big strategy ideas and then create the tactics to make those strategies happen tend to do better than the companies that are just staying in the weeds all the time and just responding to what's happening.
And obviously, you mentioned earlier, booster clubs are kind of separate from the school and from the school district. We talk to a lot of booster clubs every day, and some of them kind of feel like they may be kind of sticking their nose where they're not supposed to, especially when it comes to the coaches and the directors. They're essential parts of the program. How do they approach that?
It is this very funny relationship where like you're not the boss of me, but you are the boss of me. It's just a constant battle. And so you've got your director of your program, whether that's your band director or your coach, your athletic director, and they guide and set what the program's going to do. And I like to think of it almost as an orchestra or in concert with them. You as the booster club have to take their ideas and you have to figure out how we're going to fund them, how we're going to get the volunteers to staff all those events. And so it's a really dependent relationship that requires a lot of communication. Where we tend to see problems is where it gets siloed, where the coach is doing one thing or the band director is doing one thing and they're not talking to the booster club. Or even inside the booster club, you may have an officer doing all these things and not communicating with people. So really, the most important thing you can do is make sure that you're communicating with your program director and that inside the booster club, you've got very specific outlined roles and responsibilities, that you're approving budgets annually, you're very transparent with your financials and with your strategic planning. This is what we're doing. And I think if you do that up front, it'll help eliminate some of the back and forth, some of the problems that we see.
It's great to hear your opinion on all that. We've talked a lot about kind of long-term plan, how to run things correctly, but what about short-term things like compliance and taxes? Let's kind of dive into that. So what are some of the biggest compliance issues or things that a booster club might have to dodge or work around or not be doing correctly at all that you see?
So, when you're the parent in the program and they come to you and say, hey, would you join the booster club? You have no idea that you just joined the board of a corporation and you now have fiduciary responsibilities. Nobody ever tells you that, but you do. And one of the shifts that we've seen is as the role of the booster club has increased and the funding from the booster club has increased, there are now compliance issues on the booster club side that are really important. So most noteworthy is making sure that you're a nonprofit. So a lot of booster clubs come to us and say, well, we're a nonprofit, but we're not a 501c3. Well, that's not possible. You can't be a nonprofit without 501c3 status from the IRS. So don't do that. That's a big deal. If you try to do that, you're effectively a for-profit corporation and you may have to pay income tax on your money that you're fundraising. So you don't want to do that. The other things we've started to see is sales tax. So a lot of booster clubs think they're exempt completely from sales tax. That's not the case. Sometimes they're exempt from paying sales tax, but they are not exempt from collecting sales tax. And so it's important to make sure that they're in contact with their Secretary of State office and understand the sales tax requirements. In some states, like concessions are not taxable, but merchandise is. Sometimes there's a tax-free window where they can sell merchandise. So you just have to make sure that you're complying with all those things. Because as the booster clubs grow and grow in revenue, guess what? They get the attention of these compliance agencies like your state taxing authority, your national taxing authority, the IRS, that kind of thing. Other things they want to keep on the lookout is booster clubs should carry liability insurance, and usually directors and officers insurance. It's a good thing, particularly if you're raising more than $10,000 a year, depending on the type of activities you do, you probably want to look into insurance. It's pretty reasonable and helps protect the officers and also the booster club itself for losses.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned, obviously, as the booster club, you're trying to raise money. You're trying to raise as much money as possible. But then when you have raised the money, what do you do after that? Like you have to worry about the taxes and all the stuff after that. So it's something to think about. It's definitely a good problem to have if you're on the booster
Yeah.
board.
Yeah, it's good. It's good.
So we hear a lot of booster clubs come to us and they say, hey, we need to charge our parents these fees, these mandatory fees. And over the course of the last couple of years, we've seen that dozens of times. Where does that kind of go into a gray area?
Yeah.
What's legal? What can we do? What can't we do?
So I think this really stems from historically, and we see it mostly on the marching band side, but sometimes on the athletics, where you had to pay the school a fee to participate. Like there was some sort of class fee or participation fee. And in marching bands, it's historically been a pretty high fee. We have some marching bands that their fees are $1,000 a year or something like that. And so historically, you would have paid that to the school, and then you would have gotten to participate in the activity. As the funding has shifted to the booster club, that's created a problem because booster clubs fall under the IRS 501c3 nonprofit rules that say that the whole of the group must benefit from any funds raised, which means you cannot raise funds for any particular person, nor can you charge mandatory fees to participate. And so I think a lot of people get really wrapped around the axle on this and what they can do and what they can't do. Generally, what I say is what you should do in any good nonprofit is you should say, encourage 100% participation. And if you're being really clear on your budgeting and you're being really transparent on your financials with your parent group, and you say, hey, it takes X amount of dollars per year to provide this activity to our students. We divide that by the number of students. And so here's the fee that we would like you to pay. And we encourage 100% participation. I really think that's the best way to go about it. And usually if you do that, you'll get about 75 to 80% participation, which is about what you get on the mandatory fee side anyways. If you do a really good job hyping people up about it, and hey, we're almost 100%, you might even get to 90 or 95%. So.
And going off of fees, obviously that's one of the biggest parts of a booster club, along with all the other payments and all the other forms of money that move in and out of the booster club. We work with a lot of booster clubs every day, and they use all sorts of things for payments. A lot of the processes aren't very, very good, or we wouldn't recommend them. What are some examples of booster clubs using outdated payments or just something that just isn't going to work in the long term?
Yeah, I think you got to be careful with things like the Venmos and the PayPals and even to some extent Zelle, although that one's a little better protected. But these are really like peer-to-peer payment systems, and they don't work well in the Booster Hub environment for a lot of different reasons. And the first one is fraud. They make it really easy to send money to something that's not the Booster Club. So, for example, I just read a story the other day of fraud in a booster club, and they had made the Venmo very similar to the booster club one. Like it was just a couple letters off. So it was like Central High School Baseball 2 at whatever was the Venmo instead of Central High School Baseball. So it was really easy for the person to get all of that money sent to their Venmo account rather than to the actual booster club one. So you've got things like that. The other things, it's really easy to change the bank account where that money's deposited. That's another issue. And then some things like booster clubs don't have phone numbers. So like Venmo requires a phone number. So that makes it hard to set that up. You see the same thing a little bit there with Zelle. The best way, even with Square to some extent, you can change a lot of that very easily. I like an integrated payment processor. That's why we do it that way at Booster Hub. I mean, just to change a bank account at Booster Hub takes about a week and requires 3 documents, and that's on purpose. It's to make sure that no one volunteer just decides, I'm going to change where all the money's going, because that's not a good thing when you're raising money in a volunteer situation. So you really can get into issues with Venmo. You can have it under a personal personal account instead of a business. In that case, you might get 1099 for the money that you raise through the Venmo, and you would owe income tax on it. So that's another problem. So there's a lot of different variables that make those not the best way to accept payments from your booster club. And then, of course, cash and check have their own issues. So you want to look for an integrated solution. That really is going to give you the best protections against fraud, and it's going to also prevent some of these operational issues that we see with the other systems.
And we see a lot of issues stem from just having an unchecked treasurer or an unchecked volunteer who basically has total control of wherever it goes.
Yeah.
And not only that, but no one else knows that they have the money. What are some ways that obviously Booster Hub aimed to counteract all this? What are some ways we do
Yeah.
that?
In most of the fraud cases in nonprofit booster clubs, the embezzlement or the stealing or the theft, most of the time it's from the treasurer. And you don't want to put a dark light over the treasurer because most of them are great, hardworking people that do probably some of the most volunteer work in the whole system. But it's the easiest place to steal. So you want to make sure that the financials are transparent, that multiple people see the bank statements, multiple people see the reconcile of the bank statement, which is really important. And you also should have a checks and balance. So like, how much did we sell should be one place. And then did we get that money in the bank in another place? Because that's the easiest way to scam a booster club is to say, no, we didn't sell anything, so there's no money. But if you have a tool that's tracking this is how much we sold, then there should be that money in the bank. And so definitely recommend that. Just having a little concession stand thing where you take money and you don't have any count of what you paid for, or you don't have any inventory of what you sold. You have no idea how much money you got. You could have got 5,000 or 500. There's no way to track it unless you're also tracking inventories and quantities sold and things like that.
It seems a lot of that is working with a system that processes all this and processes credit cards. Because we see a lot of booster clubs still use cash and checks, especially things like payments and things. I assume that you would highly discourage that. What are some ways they can move to a credit card based payment system?
Yeah, a lot of times the single biggest reason not to take credit cards is fees. And I will tell you, in most booster clubs, there's more money lost with paper checks or cash than you will ever pay in credit card fees. So you're saving pennies, but you're losing dollars. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And then the other thing that we see is when you do accept credit cards, particularly places like the concession stand, the sales go up like 30%. So like you're paying 3%, but your sales went up 30%. You do the math. Are you ahead? Yeah, because people will spend more if they can just put it on a card. And sometimes boosters are so worried about the fees, they forget things like on sponsorships. I'm a business owner. We don't even have a checkbook. We pay everything on credit cards, mostly because then we get the miles and the cash back and all of that. So if I'm going to do a big sponsorship, I don't want to write you a check for it. I'm going to just put it on my card. One, it's faster and easier. And two, I get the rewards as a business owner.
And then kind of moving on, we've talked about payments, we talked about compliance. Let's talk about communication, like reaching out to people, reaching out to the members and your students. Why is it important for people to start doing texting and direct communication?
Yeah, this has really popped up over the last couple of years with SMS. So one nice thing about if you're a nonprofit, if you're a 501c3, your opt-in requirements for SMS are much easier than most for-profit businesses. So it's really easy to build a nice SMS list. And because of the barrage of things that people receive via email, and then now we've got a little app latency where people are so many apps now, they don't necessarily want to get on the app, or if you don't have a lot for them to do on the app, they may not download the app. You got to have a way to get to them. And the nice thing is SMS like cuts through all those barriers pretty quickly and makes sure that families are getting the message. So I think you definitely want to have that in your communication toolbox as a way to get a hold of your members.
And obviously SMS has some sort of fees attached. What are your thoughts on those fees and how that affects it?
Yeah, I think generally the SMS fees are nominal. So if you just put a little line item in the budget, like $50 a year or something like that, that we're going to do for SMS, it's like the stamp on the letter, right? Like it's the stamp from the letter from years ago.
And if we can kind of switch to a more broad, long-term look at booster clubs. Obviously, we talk to booster clubs daily and we see the decisions they're making day in and day out. But what are some things that they might be doing today that might affect them down the road, either positively or negatively?
Yeah, I think first of all, they need to look at board longevity in the booster club. And that starts by not looking at who's on the board this year or who you're going to get to fill your spot next month, But like looking a year down the road or 2 years down the road, like we have these families coming up in the program. Who do we know that's good volunteers? Let's have a committee that's their sole job. Their sole job is to just focus on people who would be good volunteers. Or maybe we have some holes in our families coming into the program. So maybe we need to go out into our community if that's in our bylaws and find somebody for the board. So I think board longevity is really important. I think in budgeting, making sure there's a surplus every year. So a lot of booster clubs come in with like a zero balance, thinking like our budget for the year is $48,000, so we're going to raise $48,000. That's a really bad idea because huge things happen that impact budgets significantly. So you should always add 5 or 10% to your budget, and then once you have that for the year, you don't have to spend everything you raise. That's sometimes people think in a nonprofit you do. And if you have that budget surplus over a period of time, you will gain a reserve fund and then investing that reserve fund. I mean, if you start to have $50,000 or $100,000 in your reserve fund, that can be generating income, which then offsets the cost of the program. So I think when you're really looking at a booster club strategically, you want to be looking at that long-term plan for volunteers and that long-term financial plan to make sure that you're not just trying to get through next Tuesday.
And what do you see in clubs who, you mentioned board turnover, clubs who handle board turnover well and have great volunteers lined up year after year? What makes them special?
Yeah, I think just setting up some secondary roles. So, for example, if you have a chair of concessions, have a incoming chair, someone under them that can be one, help out, two, study what's happening, three, when the top person leaves the program, the second person is all trained and ready to go. The most inclined group of volunteers is typically the freshmen or the newcomers in the program. They're excited. So take that excitement and turn it into volunteering. Some programs are like, no, we've got all the board spots filled. We don't need you. It's like the worst thing you can do. You've got all these people that are excited and they want to participate, and you can grow them into roles. And there's some nuances, like if you're a sports team and the kid's not going to make the team, you kind of have to take some of that into account. But again, if you step back and you're not trying to plan for next Tuesday, but you're trying to plan for next year, it helps you see things a little bit differently. And you can go, okay, we do need some long-term board position recruiting done so that we can have a treasurer in 2028. We're not just looking for this year and next year.
And for some clubs who may feel that they don't have maybe some of that excitement you mentioned, how do they build that? How do they get incoming people to be excited to volunteer and to join the board?
Yeah, if you don't have it right now and you're behind the curve, the best thing you can do is we did a podcast with the band dads, and Scott Lang said it the best. You have to create FOMO. You have to make it sound like it is so exciting and so much fun to volunteer for the Booster Club that people then start calling you and say, how do I get involved? So instead of saying, if we don't get any volunteers by Friday, we're going to have to cut the program. You have to be like, oh my gosh, we are having the biggest party on Friday. It's going to be so much fun. And we've got like most of the spots filled, but I think we can squeeze a few more volunteers. And then people are like, oh man, they're doing cool stuff, instead of like, oh man, that's punishment to go work for the Booster Club. So I think like Scott, he like really hit the nail on the head. You got to create some FOMO and then form a nominating committee like ASAP. If you've got one volunteer, put them on that job. Your job is to find us more volunteers. I need one person dedicated to that.
And then if you could give one piece of advice or have every Booster Club leader in the entire country do one thing tomorrow, what would you recommend that is?
Oh my goodness. This is going to sound it's so tactile and it's so in the weeds, but I think it's like one of the biggest things that I could say to all booster clubs is make sure your bank account is reconciled. It's really funny because if you're doing that well, you're doing a lot of other things well. You know that your financials are in good shape. You know that your budget's in good shape. You've got somebody doing their job on the financials and what the booster club's going to be able to provide. And so it's a very tactile thing. I've been talking about strategy. If I had one thing that I would make sure is that I would make sure your bank account's reconciled.
When you were the Booster Club president, was your bank account reconciled?
It was every month. It was I say that we ended up with a tax issue. It was a silly thing like a box on a form wasn't checked. So you're going to have things come up that you're going to have to deal with. And one year we didn't raise quite enough money to do everything we wanted to do. So we had to juggle that. So you've always got something going on. Your job as the leader of a booster club is to run the nonprofit corporation, make sure it's being done well. And that one process will help you check a lot of boxes.
I have one last question for you. We ask every guest this, but what sport did you play in high school? Or what activity did you do? And then kind of how did that shape you into your
Yeah, that's
adulthood?
a good question. Well, I'm from Centerville High School in Centerville, Ohio, home of the Elks, and we were a powerhouse and Centerville still is a powerhouse in almost every activity. I started in volleyball, but broke my arm and ended up a softball player. I did a stint on cross country for half a season, didn't do well there. And then in middle school, I was on the drill team. So I was on the kick line and did that. So it kind of dipped in everywhere. And then, of course, as a mom, I got to volunteer in soccer and tennis and volleyball. And oh my gosh, there was like powerlifting and there are a few other sports.
A little bit of band too,
Little
band and
bit of
orchestra.
band. Yeah, we did some band volunteering. So like I've kind of dipped my toe into all the different areas and got to experience it all. And then of course the Booster Hub, where I'm really the team mom for 1,000 different booster clubs across the country. I say that it'd be our team, Marsha and some of the others do a great job helping everybody. So we really love our roles to kind of jump in and help these volunteers figure out what they need to do and improve things and make it so they spend less time in all the weeds and they get to spend more time enjoying their kids.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Robin, it was great to hear from you today. Sorry for asking so many questions. You've had all this experience and you work with booster clubs every day. So I know a lot of the listeners are getting a lot of value out of this, definitely.
Well, it's great. It's one of those cases where you don't know what you don't know. And so sometimes just somebody bringing it up and pointing it out makes you go, oh, I should check in on that. And it might save you a lot of time and hassle. Thanks for joining us today, Evan. I always love when we get to flip the role. So we'll look forward to having you on again soon.
Yeah, I'm excited.
The Boosted Volunteer is brought to you by Booster Hub. To find out more about Booster Hub and how our app can help you improve communications, increase engagement, raise more money, and manage your booster club responsibly, visit www.boosterhub.com. And then make sure to search for Booster Club Podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Booster Hub, thanks for listening.